Hey, everybody, and thank you very much for coming back and joining us here on BizBooks. My name is Gene Marks, and as you know by now, this is the podcast, James, right? Or YouTube channel. We're trying to figure out what to call this. It's really a series of interviews with great authors of great business books that we can all learn from. And I am honored and happy to have today my guest, James White. He is the author of Anti-Racist Leadership: How to Transform Corporate Culture in a Race Conscious World. So James, I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining me. I'm really glad that you're here.
Gene, thanks for having me on the platform. Love the work that you do, and looking forward to our conversation.
I like that, the platform. That's what we should start calling it. It's just we'll just say it's the platform, and that will work out well. Well, good. So James, so let's dig in. I bought the book, read the book, love the book. Um, First of all, let's find out a little about you and also about your daughter Krista.
Sure.
So tell us a little bit of background of yourself and how you came to be writing this book.
Uh, Gene, my background, I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, working class family. Part of my personal biography, I'm first member of my family to graduate from college, which is a really important through line for me. I'm obviously a relatively accomplished Black executive. I've been a public company CEO. I ran Jamba Juice for a number of years as CEO, worked with Fortune 500 companies. So I've seen a number of places, from the Coca-Cola company to Nestle, Purina, to Safeway stores, in executive roles across those companies. I've sat in the boardroom. Um, so as we thought about this book project, we thought there would be a unique perspective that is not in the marketplace around the topic of anti-racist leadership and DEI, that was from the perspective of a Black executive who's been a public company CEO, who sits in public and private company boards, so from policy to the front line of
Sure.
businesses, and really knows what the operational levers are to really making sustainable change in this space. Um, the force multiplier in the project was me being able to team up with my millennial daughter, Krista, who's a Columbia University alum. She's a startup founder in her own right. She's a brilliant writer and analyst. So her millennial perspective is feathered throughout the book, which I think is important for leaders because, for many of us, our consumer bases are going to be millennial and Gen Z. Many of our workforces are going to be millennial and Gen Z. And we thought that would be an appropriate way to really go at this really important topic and bring to life a playbook of sorts with rich answers and lots of examples.
Yeah, it's funny you talk about millennials. So I have three kids. They're all in their late 20s. The millennial generation, people malign the generation. And yet my personal experiences from the people that I meet, they're friends, they're hardworking. It's a nicer generation than our generation. I just want to say,
Sure.
they're more aware of the world around them. They are more diverse and they're more respectful, which gives me hope for the future. But it's, having her perspective to help you. I mean, what was her involvement in helping you write this book?
She would have been my partner throughout. And Gene, one of the ways that I start when I do many of these discussions is I read the very first paragraph of the book, and then I share
Sure.
the backstory. And I think that'll be an important
Yeah, let's do it.
context for your audience on this platform. So
Sure.
I'll start. This is the first paragraph of the book, and I'll share a bit of the backstory, which I think will also be instructive.
Okay.
This book is not apolitical. This book is explicitly anti-racist, pro-Black, pro-LGBTQIA, and feminist. This book takes the stance that Black Lives Matter, that LGBTQIA plus rights are human rights, that people of all abilities deserve respect and access, and that people of all genders have the right to sovereignty over their bodies and identities. This book acknowledges that capitalism is built on a foundation of systemic racism, and that to have a truly diverse, equitable, and inclusive work environment, we must acknowledge the historic and present injustices faced by marginalized people. So that paragraph in total was written in late May, early June of 2020. Krista comes to me. We've got a planning session with the team that was helping us edit and shape. And she says, "Dad, I've got a different way to start our book." So she shares it with me. I take a little pause. I think about it overnight. I don't commit to, hey, that's the path we go down. But I was so compelled by the forcefulness of her voice and the clarity of this paragraph as a thesis for really the entirety of our book. I read it to the team that was on the call the next day, and one of the members of the team says, "James, you're a mainstream business person. Do you care if you ever work again?" And I said, "No, I really don't."
Right.
This is such an important time in the history of really the world and business. I happen to have a set of experiences that I think will be helpful in catalyzing for this conversation, and this is the perfect way to start the book.
I agree. I agree. So in the very beginning of the book, you jump into and start talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and you asked the question, why is achieving DEI so hard? And I must preface this, James, with saying that I do a lot of writing and I do a lot of speaking, and I speak to businesses all around the country. These are associations, industry groups, manufacturing, the most boring industries in the world, from packaging people to metal fabricators to construction groups to whatever. Okay. They are rooms of 150 to 300 middle-aged white men. And if you ask these owners and senior managers of these companies about DEI, they all say that it's part of their strategy, it's part of their objectives. They want DEI, they want to have more diversity in their companies, but they all say it's very hard. Why do they say that? Why is achieving true DEI so hard, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's hard or it's easy.
Right.
Kind of the foundational point that we make really throughout the book is this work has to be about culture. You can't separate anti-racist leadership or DEI from the work of culture. And if you're the CEO, she can't delegate that work. So the first premise of this book is the leaders that sit in those rooms that you're in, they've got to take ownership and leadership of this work. They've got to model this work from their seats, but it doesn't really stop there. We've got to step back and analytically kind of audit the cultures inside our companies from the perspective of every system that touches people in an organization. And we've got to work hard to unbias every one of those systems that touch humans, from the hiring systems to how we promote people, to how we onboard people that are new to the company, to how promotions happen, to how critical assignments and the compositions of those teams get formulated, to how we're all incentivized to do our work.
Right. Makes sense. It makes sense. Now, I often hear the same question being asked by these same leaders over and over again. It's a question that you literally say in the beginning of your book that's actually the wrong question to ask. And the question is, how do you square DEI with the need to hire whoever seems to be the most qualified and capable candidate for the job? Why do you say that that's the wrong question to ask?
Yeah, and sometimes the most qualified question gets asked from the context of we're trying to find culture fits, and that's definitely the wrong question. The question that I ask differently is I want people that are going to be additive to my culture and company. So that's fundamentally what I'm looking for, is people that can add to the richness and capability and experience of the company. And when you ask that different question, it takes you down a different path you're evaluating people maybe, from a different perspective.
Got it. You write as well about high potential employees and leaders, and you say that hiring high potential people can be potentially biased. Can you, first of all, define what you mean by high potential, and then tell me why you think that would be potentially biased?
Yeah, and if we think about high potential, and I think the exact example I share is really one of my own, and I make the point that I've never been promoted to the next job, and I've had lots of promotions. I had 13 different jobs and promotions during my time at Nestle Purina, as an example.
Hmm.
And the point that I try to make is oftentimes uh, Black executives or, you know, folks from underrepresented communities have to prove it again and prove it again and prove it again. And that's driven by, when we're looking at people's potential, we look for people that have similar backgrounds, similar approaches to thinking about a business, maybe from similar schools. And that excludes
Mm,
folks like me very often that are, kind of first generation college graduates,
I see.
not a part of the networks, from a business uh, perspective, might have even different hobbies. Golf was pretty prevalent really throughout my career, and a lot of the incremental face time that folks would have would be, on the golf course. It's not a sport I grew up playing. Uh, but even the rituals inside of companies on how things get done work to exclude some folks from access to leadership and opportunities.
It tell me if this makes sense. And what I'm getting, what you're saying is, if you have a white guy that's Ivy League, educated, and maybe spent time on some Wall Street firms, or has that sort of corporate, credentials, you automatically think this person is a high potential person. And when you compare them to, say, a Black guy that did not go to the Ivy League, or maybe doesn't have a college education, could be just as qualified, just as smart, but because they wouldn't necessarily be considered to be a high potential, because he doesn't look like the guy that you would expect to be successful in another role, that's where the bias comes in. Is that, am I
It
saying
does.
that?
And one other example we share in the book, and I was talking to a Black female executive last week, big technology company, and she had never heard anybody describe this in the way I described it. And as I looked at some of the moves that I make, I would come into a new job and I would literally have to prove why I belonged in the room. And I don't know if
Yeah.
you remember this from the book, where literally I would have to start from zero and try to get to 90.
Yeah.
The same white guy would start at 100, and
Yeah.
all he had to do is figure out how not to lose 10 points, and then it's on to the next thing.
Yeah.
But I've firstly got to try to prove why I actually belong in the same room. And some of this is a part of the unconscious bias, and people don't even realize that that's how they're evaluating, candidates very, very differently. The other thing that happens is all the Black or brown candidates or women in some companies have to be great. They have to be super achievers. So there is no room for the average performing candidate that comes from a different background.
Right. You write about when you first became CEO of Jamba Juice, how you did like an audit of the company culture. And I think that, the story that you told is so valuable to anybody running a company. And by the way, my audience, mainly small and mid-sized companies, with some larger companies mixed in. But tell me the story about how you audited the company culture at Jamba Juice, what you did and why it was important.
Yeah, for me, across the first 100 days or so, I wanted to hear from all the key stakeholders in the organization to figure out what was working, what wasn't working so well, and then what were some of the ideas on how we might improve. So literally first day on the job, I meet with the 100+ employees that were in our support center headquarter for Jamba and kicked off a session. And so that there was anonymity to the feedback, I passed out a card, and at the end of the discussion, I shared a bit about my background and my family and,
Sure.
my expectations as CEO. When I, had 100+ responses on, here are the 1 to 3 things I'd like to see James do as CEO. Here are the things that are really working well that I'd love for us to preserve. And then here are a couple ideas that might be helpful as we try to move the company ahead. And just the richness of that input from the associate base inside the company was important. But I repeated that with each board member in one-on-ones. I work with our top and key suppliers to get feedback. Jamba was a public company. I wanted to also hear from the analysts that evaluated the company and really bake that all into how we laid out the multi-year strategy to transform the company. And again, people and culture of the organization was really foundational to how we did the turnaround and transformation at Jamba.
Right. And what did you find? I mean, this was done with an objective of improving DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. What did you find there? And then what did you do to improve it?
Yes, I'd make a couple points. I mean, the objective of that audit was really to improve the performance of the company.
Okay.
The opportunity to leverage DEI was a byproduct of the rigorous analysis to strengthen the culture, add to the composition of the company differently, to unlock talent that I found in the organization that might have come from more diverse or different backgrounds.
Okay.
And I think the biggest lessons, which would be a shock to your readers, is that we weren't as diverse as we needed to be, given our consumer base, especially in the leadership ranks.
Yeah.
We weren't as diverse as we needed to be in the boardroom. There were, so if you think about our consumer base, it would have been 60% plus women. We had an all-male board. So any companies that really don't bring the perspective of their key targeted consumers, that's going to be a miss, from the starting point.
Sure.
As just one observation, we had a fall off of women and people of color as you moved up through the executive ranks of the company. And those were some opportunities to really leverage just fantastic talent that was present in the company, that was looking for opportunities to grow that we hadn't previously.
You give some thoughts, which I'd like you to share here, about chief diversity officers. Many companies are hiring chief diversity officers. You say that the CEO has to be in charge of DEI. Does that mean that you should not have a chief diversity officer in your company?
No, I'm making a really different point.
Okay.
The foundational point is the chief executive can't delegate this work and walk away from it. And many of the companies that I see adding chief diversity officers, they do so in many cases after a crisis. So it's a job that has relatively high turnover. If you step back and just look at the appointments of chief diversity officers, the shelf life is probably less than 2 years. In many cases, is following an incident in the company, and it's more a risk mitigating. I view it in some cases almost a diversion, from what really needs to happen. Where I think chief diversity officers really work is when they're integrated into the strategy, the core strategy of the company. They've got a portfolio where they can really have and impact in the organization. I love it when, especially in larger companies, when that chief diversity officer sits on the executive team of the CEO, because they have a seat at the table, a voice, and they have an opportunity to really impact the company in a material way. And I'll give a couple of examples.
Yeah.
I sit on the board of a retailer, Snook Supermarkets, and that CEO, Todd Snook, like many leaders, was shocked by the murder of George Floyd and the racial reckoning and all the conversation that happened. He, committed probably 6 months before that. He added a chief diversity officer at the company. But post the George Floyd murder, he, pulled me in as a board member, said, James, I really want your help and attention around this work. And what I watched him do, and we've been doing this now for 2 years, he visits with the chief diversity officer, the chief people officer, and one line executive on a weekly basis on the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Every single week, 2 full years, and then has me to come in as a board member. He knows that I have experience in the area. He knew I was working on this book and had lots of examples. But on a monthly basis, I'm in a conversation with diversity, on diversity with the CEO on a monthly basis. And he's put himself in a place where he's learning and growing really across the time, and it's positioning him to make better calls inside his company. So that's the point I make when I say you can't delegate this work.
Right.
He's one example, an example of just a fantastic DEI executive is Libra Clemens at Twilio. That's not in the book. I continue to kind of update my knowledge on the space, but she's published fantastic reports on anti-racist leadership, sits on the executive team with the CEO at Twilio, and has published fantastic work. And I share that so that your readers can, go to other examples. And we try to really do that throughout the book so that there are examples of big companies, smaller companies, technology companies, restaurant or retail companies.
Couple of hard questions here that just come to mind. Your book is about being an anti-racist leader. Clearly there are a lot of companies that you've come across that you don't have diversity, equity, and inclusion for whatever reason. Like you said, it could be an all board of white men, or senior executives are mostly men, and again, whites. Does that mean that a company or their leadership is necessarily racist in your opinion because they don't have that diversity, or is it something else?
I just think there's certainly a blind spot in the world that we live in. I think we're going to have stakeholder groups. Gene, we talked about our millennial children.
Yeah.
There is a next generation that has grown up in a more multicultural world. Yes. That's their expectation. That's who we're going to be leading in the workforce, and we're actually doing harm to our businesses. Let's call it a blind spot. If we'd like, you can call it a stasis that relates to the just the status quo, and I like things the way that they are, but it's certainly a missing.
Right.
From where I sit, it's a really clear kind of missed opportunity, and the best place to start change is at the executive level, because people that are going to be attracted to companies moving forward, as we think about the future of work and the great resignation that has happened, they're going to want to see that there's an opportunity for people like them inside our companies.
Which brings me to my next question is, to me, we are talking about our kids as well, and they're part of that millennial generation, and it is more diverse. And sometimes I feel like, James, like it's a generational issue. Like these things are improving over time. Where now, I mean, you have to admit, if somebody is committed to building a more diverse workforce, there are just there are less Black college graduates. There are less qualified, at least from a technical or an educational standpoint, say, Black candidates for jobs than whites, and yet that number's improving a lot. It's getting better. And I just sometimes think that, like, well, when our kids eventually move into, as they get older, their generation gets older and becomes part of management, that that population of Black and brown and female and different genders and all that's going to improve over time. It'll almost be like a natural transition. What are
Yeah, I
your
don't know
thoughts
if
on
I
that?
agree with the point. I don't
Okay.
know if I agree with the point that there are less
That's
potential candidates. I think the point that I'd make is we've got to look different places. So if we think about, and many of the companies that are doing this work are focused on historically Black colleges and universities. And the way I think about more or less is if you just look at the representation of the population that we're pulling from. And I'll give an example of a board that I sat on at the time. Medallia, that CEO, and they're in the technology industry, had 1% representation of Blacks at Medallia. He
right.
made a personal commitment to move the representation from 1% to 13% over 4 years. And what I can report to your audience is that in less than 2 years, he was able to move that number from 1% to north of 7% on the way to 13%.
Okay.
So uh, it's a will versus kind of a lack of talent. You might have to look in different places, but I'll tell you the motivating factor is the CEO's Leslie Stretch, and he and his leadership team held themselves accountable from an equity compensation perspective. And you and I both know in the tech world, most of my compensation is equity. And
Yep.
once that was at risk and the target was clear, make no mistake, they'll get to those numbers and that team will get compensated. And I think more people that take that spirit towards this work, will make significant progress. But we've got to look at different pools to access more diverse candidates. This new hybrid at work world that we live in gives us all opportunities. So if the company is in Boise, Idaho, or Salt Lake City, Utah, you might say, well, hey, James, my population is a lot less diverse than some other places. But if you've got a national consumer base and you've got folks that are working in a hybrid fashion or virtually, you also have access to places like Detroit and Atlanta and DC. And there are more innovative solutions that I'm watching companies make to access talent in different places.
So I want to talk about the actual playbook that you recommend for changing the culture in your company. But before I do, to implement that playbook, because everything that you have in this, it's the 7 steps that you give. They're hard. And before we get into that, I one final hard question for you is,
Sure.
in the wake of the Floyd killing, in the wake of all this awareness for more diversity and the bias that's out there, sometimes, again, I'm telling you, for somebody who covers business, I write
Sure.
about business. I see a lot of companies just making, gestures for more PR purposes than
Sure.
actually doing the hard work. 'Cause I just asked you before about, like, well, it's there's not as many, Black college graduates, or there's not whatever, and your response was, rightfully so, yeah, they're out there if you want to work hard to find them. And even when you find people, it doesn't. If you're really motivated to change your culture, you can provide the additional training to people. You can get them up to, if you really want to do it, you can. I just feel like a lot of companies that I see, they say they're going to do this. Maybe they contribute a bunch of money to some minority, nonprofit. You know what I mean? Or they
Sure.
issue their statement that they don't follow through. I'm just curious, before we get into this 7 steps. I mean, do you feel the same way? Do you feel like there's, like, a lot of empty gestures being made rather than actual commitment by companies in this country to really make changes to their culture?
Yeah, I think there's a couple points. I would agree with, so if I go back to 2020, there's a couple hundred of the largest, companies in America or globally that made anti-racist
Of
statements
course.
that we could all go Google and publish, and they made commitments to donate money.
Right.
One of the things that I think if we went back and audited what actually happened, probably a fraction of the money that was committed has really made it to places that matter to kind of change
Right.
our communities or change the face of our companies, or if we just looked at just the results of the boards in those companies or the executive teams, you might see little or limited progress. The best leaders view this as an opportunity to strengthen their companies and culture, and they're going to put in the work like Todd Snook that I talked about. I work with another CEO at Bay Club. It's a lifestyle fitness company. He also, around that same time, made a significant commitment of time. He appointed his first diversity officers, a husband and wife team to lead the work, and they took themselves, the company, on a learning journey. They've made commitments, and I also meet with that set of leaders on a monthly basis. So this is it's a commitment. The work can sometimes be difficult, but I think the best companies moving forward are going to distinguish themselves as an employer of choice that make the commitment. And it's certainly the right thing to do, but this is to create a better business moving forward.
Okay. So let's say, we put ourselves in a position with that, we know that this is going to improve our companies. We know we're committed to improving diversity in the company. And diversity could be, more Black and brown faces or more female faces or, whatever you define that to be. You offer 7 steps, like a playbook for changing the culture in your company. And I don't want to put you on the spot to I don't know if you can rattle them all off in your, but I've got them here. And I'm gonna list them off, and I'm gonna ask you to talk a little bit about them because
Sure.
As just some advice to someone that's watching this, to myself, I have 10 employees, so we're very small. But to
Sure.
somebody that does want to make that commitment, so you say to actively listen and learn. You say to enlist and align across the senior leadership team. You say to audit the culture. We talked a little bit about that before, what you did at Jamba Juice. Document what you're doing now. Establish benchmarks. Build action learning teams or task forces, and develop an action plan. So let's go back over those 7 steps. Talk to me a little bit.
Yeah, I'll bring it
What
to
would you-
life in this way, and really kind of the fundamental point is the chief executive. She's got to lead
Okay.
this work. We've got to, almost like an archaeologist, got to document what we do. We've got to look at what are our rituals, what are all the systems that touch people, and this is where the system and process part of the work that has to happen comes in. One of the things that I pull into this idea around, kind of activating change around action learning, the fundamental place to drive this work is through the middle management of the company.
Yeah.
That's the place where the change typically stalls in most companies.
You call them
And
catalysts for change, or your middle managers, right?
yeah, and you really have to make sure that group of leaders, one, you have to have them participate if there is a strike team or an action team helping you audit the culture and craft kind of the strategy for the company. The most critical place to make sure that we've got the right tools, resources, and training is the middle management of an organization. And I give an example of a large distribution company that might have 20,000 employees, but they've got a couple hundred middle managers that they really need to focus on giving the right tools and the right incentives. because the reality is most of us experience the companies that we work for through our immediate supervisors or the middle management of an organization. And really, the final point around keeping score is everything in business that matters, we measure it
Yes.
and we keep score in some routine fashions, whether it's monthly or quarterly or annually or all of those. And then we incent people to do it. And, having some way to tie incentives to getting this work done by critical leaders in an organization is essential.
You do talk about the metrics for DEI. Can you dig a little bit deeper down into that? Like, what if I am following those 7 steps in the playbook, and I do want to see progress and results? Can you share some specific metrics that we might want to be tracking that will tell us if we're getting anything done?
I think you start where you are. So a part of the auditing is just understanding the overall composition of the demographics of your organization in total. One of the places where there is a little bit of kabuki theater, many organizations are going to be pretty diverse. If I take the restaurant industry, which I came out of, you're
Right.
going to have a really diverse workforce in the frontline workforce. 2/3 of the employees are going to be women or people of color in the restaurant industry. As you move up through the leadership levels, that diversity disappears precipitously. So a bit of the theater that I've seen is people take the aggregate numbers and try to portray a more diverse workforce. But as you move into executive and senior levels of the organization, they become significantly less diverse and almost non-existent into the boardroom. So just the demographics of the organization in lots of different ways is important, and that's something that you measure over time. I gave the Snook Supermarket example. They've got targets for how they want to see improvement, and that's one of the things that the CEO holds his team accountable to over time. There are qualitative measures around training and exposure, so that is more just activity based. We're going to deploy this set of training on this timing. There is work around our supplier bases, so supplier diversity in the ecosystem that we build to create a more inclusive culture includes the diversity of our suppliers, from professional services companies that provide services to our company to hard goods if I'm procuring kind of hard product goods. So that's another place. But it's going to be customized by the organization. I always advise people to fit it to their overall business strategy, but measure it and put it in the MBOs or KPIs of the organization and measure it like you measure everything else that's important.
When we talk about measurement, and this is kind of near and dear to me, my heart. I'm a CPA, and I'm thinking of a client of mine that I have actually in Trenton, New Jersey. They have about 150 employees. 3 brothers run the company. 3 white guys, middle-aged white guys, and they everything they do, James, is based on ROI. You know what I mean? Like
Sure.
they will spend $250,000 on a piece of equipment because they know once they get that up and running in 30 days, it's going to churn out a number of sheets of material that's going to make them such and such money over the next 3 years. You know what I mean? Like that's what they drive.
Sure.
So for me to go and say, hey, you've got to you've got to improve your DEI because it's good for the business. They're going to come back and say to me, all right, I mean, that sounds intangibly good, but why should we make this effort in the sense of like, show me the money, like what's the return on investment for doing something like this? If I want to hire a guy to run this piece of equipment, they're going to tell me, I don't care if he's black or green or blue. I just want to make sure he's qualified to do it so I can make money off him and make money off of this job. Do you know what I mean? So what do I say to a client like that? In the sense of we were talking about metrics, and
Sure.
benchmarks. How do you is there any way to quantitatively measure the ROI of having a diverse workforce?
Yeah, there are lots of studies that prove that having a more diverse workforce, the business case has been made many years ago. The very specific point in this case that I'd make is uh, the clients that we're selling into increasingly are more diverse. If you're doing any work with government organizations,
Mm,
uh, they're going to want to understand the makeup and composition of your organization. As we think about just the change in demographics and the challenges that almost everybody's having with their workforce, it's
mm.
just smart business to look different places so that you're not one of those organizations that can't find employees to fill critical jobs. Most of the industries that I sit in, we're all challenged, from retail to restaurants, challenged to have an appropriate set of employees, and it's just good business.
It's not just that you actually bring up a really good point because I'm thinking again of this client of mine. They have some large corporate customers and they also do some work for the government. And they are and will be asked even more about the demographic makeup of their workforce because these corporate customers have their own goals to work with
Sure.
suppliers.
And a
And,
part of your goals is going to be your supply chain.
yeah, that's right. And you mentioned this in the book about making sure that your own supply chain is diverse. But if I'm talking to this client of mine, I could say, guys, you talk about ROI, you could be missing out on projects and jobs from some of these larger customers
Sure.
who may have an issue because your company is not, racially diverse enough. And I think that argument itself could hit very well home for business owners.
This is just good business. I
Yeah,
mean, we live in a pretty diverse country. They're based in New Jersey.
yeah,
That's going to be a pretty diverse state. I'd argue it won't be hard to find
true.
diverse talent in New
Yeah.
Jersey.
True. You are right. All right, couple more questions for you, and then I'll let you go. This is it's such an enlightening conversation. You near the end of the book, you have a checklist for CEOs, and which is really to me like one of the most important sections of the book. And again, I don't want to give away everything. I want people to buy this book and read it. We go into a
Sure.
lot more detail of it. But just a couple things on this checklist I just had to ask you some questions about. Like, for example, one of the things that you say is to develop your personal strategy and style for discussing race, racism, and diversity, including the terminology you're going to use. Okay. I'm thinking again about this client of mine in New Jersey. I don't think I would want those guys talking about race and racism and diversity in their own personal style, So I guess my question is like, would you recommend hiring a consultant or getting some outside advice to help you formulate what that messaging should be?
Yeah, I think the main point that I'd make is um, we've all got to show a little bit of grace around this topic, and I think what you'll find um, in the book is we try to give people just lots of different examples to tackle what is a difficult subject. And the best leaders that I've seen do this work, they try to listen more than they talk. They try to understand other people's stories, but they also share their stories, looking for places where there might be some commonality. And I just think, kind of meeting, especially for the CEOs, this is a place where the CEOs and the key executives won't have all the answers. They take themselves on kind of a learning journey. I share examples in the book uh, where there are CEOs that pick a book and they have everybody in the organization read the same book and they have a conversation that might be facilitated on that book.
Right.
I've got a client that I'm working with in 2 weeks. There is a program called Amend that has 6 series, and they're having the whole organization. This is a larger technology company. Everybody's going to watch over 6 weeks that program, and then they're having honest discussions. They're using one of their resource group. So the Black resource group in this case made that recommendation. They've got other resource groups that relate to women and the LGBTQIA community that might lead the next learning session. So I think there are lots of different ways to tackle this work, but I think we've all got to have open hearts and kind of open minds, and just know that nobody's going to have all the answers. The language around this work is going to continue to change
Right.
over time. And we've just got to get started where we are.
Final question is, and again, still on that checklist, you also recommend that a CEO handpicks a core group of executives, HR managers, middle level managers to be those catalysts for change. And I'm wondering if you can offer any advice as to what we should be looking for in those people.
I think there's a couple things. For me, I would try to make sure this action learning team or catalyst group is maybe more diverse than our companies and comes from lots of different backgrounds and perspectives. That you have picked different levels in the organization to really make sure that there is a voice and some representation from the middle management of the organization, someone that can be a part of that group that can really tell you how things work and don't work inside the organization. That voice will be critically important. And, for me, finally, people that have the capacity to really grow and kind of think about our companies on more an enterprise level, kind of pulling them out of a functional area, and can really help us, create a better culture and a better company.
The book is called Anti-Racist Leadership: How to Transform Corporate Culture in a Race-Conscious World. I have been speaking with James White. He is one of the authors. He co-authored this book with his daughter, Krista White. James, great conversation, great book. Highly recommend that everyone purchases it. Any final thoughts before I let you go? And by the way, we'll say goodbye, but don't sign off yet, because I want to say goodbye to you personally after the recording stops.
Sure. Gene, this has been fantastic. This is really, really important work. We actually believe anti-racist leadership is going to be a key capability as we think about the future of work. Social items and getting this right has never been more important as companies, big and small, are thinking about topics like ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And we think anti-racist leadership can help spark the discussion. And there's a lot of really actionable material in the book.
That is great. You can get the book on Amazon and any other place that sell great books like this. And James, is there any specific place we can follow you or find you online?
You can find me on LinkedIn, and feel free to reach out. This is a passion work for me, and I'm always willing to enter the discussion to really help companies and leaders advance their work in this area.
I will reach out to you and connect on LinkedIn myself. James, thank you so much. That was it was just like I said, it was great speaking with you. Everyone, you've been watching another episode of Biz Books, where we interview great and smart authors of great business books. Thank you so much for watching and listening. My name is Gene Marks. We'll be back in another 2 weeks with another great author talking about another great book.